So far, we've talked about making lesson plans, what do you do with data in the classroom, how do you make activities. So I wanted to look at it from a different perspective, which is now that you know all of this great stuff about interactional competence and doing these things in the classroom, how do you incorporate this into your curriculum or your course plan? And it's especially relevant for me because I just did this for the Russian course in the last month and a half. So, where do you start when planning a course? How do you choose course goals, and what is most important to you when you're deciding them for the year or the semester? Where do you start when planning a course?
So I start at the end. I imagine a project my students will be able to do towards the end.
Maybe how do you choose your goals?
I think about the vocabulary that's going to be covered in a certain segment, and then how many communicative, real-world type activities can I put in the course for them to master that vocabulary and not just memorize it.
What is the most important thing to you in planning?
Connection of what you teach and what you evaluate.
Making sure it's all coherent, part of the same goals.
Okay, I'm thinking if you have the course goals as an end, so there's an immense number of possibilities of how you can get a path to those goals.
And it's good to consider outside standards of goals, especially when you're sending your students out into a world that considers those standards. But there are also other standards you can take into account, and that way making them more well-rounded in the eyes of the people who create the standards, which would be ACTFL, CEFR, the Common European Framework, and others that are often language-specific. So we'll come back to this in a minute, but I just want to mention often what people talk about in this situation is backward design, which is you think about what you want students to be able to do at the end, what do you want them to learn. You think about what they should be, how they should perform at the end of the semester or year, and then you define your learning objectives based on that. And so I'm going to differentiate throughout this between course goals, which are the broad things that might be informed by ACTFL or other things, and then learning objectives, which are the concrete list of things you would create for Russian 101, for example. And these are informed by your larger course goals. So they work together, right? They're not obviously not separate, so then you're not teaching what you don't test, et cetera. Considering everything that we've talked about over the last 2 days, what do you like about what you're going to be doing this year? And have you thought about anything you would like to change? And I brought up grades because I'm going to bring it back up in a second when I talk about how I fit IC into my syllabus. But just start thinking about that. So what do you really like that you have, and what would you like to change based on what we've been talking about over the last 2 days? So I looked at what I would be doing this semester and decided that based on what we're doing here in the center, there was a lot I wanted to change. And this is my first time teaching at Rice. I wasn't teaching this last year when I was here, so I'm starting from scratch with the Russian course. So now I want to talk about, I looked at my syllabus, I looked at the last time I taught first semester Russian, and I decided what I wanted to do differently or the same. And so we're going to talk about looking at a syllabus you've already done, which is what I did, and finding room for ICs. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, we've been talking about interactional competence from the bottom up, which is lesson plans, classroom activities, the sort of nitty-gritty of the day-to-day classroom. What do you do? So far, we've been talking about basically bottom up with some bigger level things, and I want to talk about top down. So if you look at your syllabus that you know you're going to be using, or your course plan, or whatever it is that you happen to use in your teaching, how, where, and why does this fit? How, where, and why does it fit into my course goals? And what are my specific learning objectives that I already have or can easily add that are related to interactional competence? So this is where you consider all the things we've been talking about, which is data availability, textbook content, the goals you've already created, so you're not doing something that's so outside of your course goals and your path that you'll follow. And then how can I evaluate these things is a difficult question. Finding room for IC. First, we're going to talk about course goals and learning outcomes. If you look at number 1 on your handout, on the previous version, that is the last time I taught Intro to Russian, what I listed as my broad course goals. And you see it says communicative skills, learning about cultural context and manifestations, whatever that means, and recognizing and understanding similarities between cultures. That's what I wrote the last time I taught this course. And I just looked at that and I said, well, what does communicative skills mean? That's pretty vague. So I rewrote it. And you can see underneath, everything I bolded is new. So critical understanding of Russian language use, starting to develop that, analyzing Russian in context and in interaction, demonstrating basic interactive skills, and learning how language changes according to cultural and social context. I was probably already doing that because you address formality in your first semester, politeness, but now I've explicitly written into my goals a way to understand that and a new framework for it. So that's how I looked at my goals and said, well, some of these are great and some of these need to change and I can make them better. For learning outcomes, which is number 2, which is where I put the concrete things, I would already have listed on a syllabus carrying on basic conversation, using everyday expressions and phrases, following written and spoken instructions, and being aware of formality and politeness. These are things that I probably would have written on any syllabus for an introductory Russian course, right? But also, they are places that I see fits. So I already had them. Now I can do them differently or add to them. And then these are the things I added that I wanted to be my specific interactional competence related targets in first semester Russian. And it's because you're going to do greetings and goodbyes in first semester Russian. That's one of the biggest things you do in first semester of a language is how to say hello and goodbye to someone. And then first semester students really need to be able to say, uh-oh, something went wrong here. Can you say that slowly? Can you repeat that for me? And then this is something that we've been talking about, helping them, especially on those self-reflections, analyze what they're doing with their language. So starting that in the first semester. So if you look on the handout at number 2, the previous version is what I would have had. And then the current version, I didn't bold some of the bullet points. Those are things that would have already been there. And I bolded the ones I added. So basically, I looked at what I already had. I found room for interactional competence, and I included it or added it. The way I did this, which might be helpful, is I looked at what I would be teaching this semester in my book that I'm having my students purchase, which is a first-year Russian textbook. We are going to cover greetings, goodbyes, but also introductions. They're going to introduce each other or friends or whatever. Question-answer sequences. That's one of the first things you do. Question words, who, where, how, what, why, when. And talking on the phone. That's in the first semester content of this textbook. Simple invitations. It actually says simple invitations. And compliments. So these are things that are already written into my course if I follow the textbook that I have decided to use. And they are places where I can now add more to what the book gives me, which is, as we have demonstrated, not ideal in a lot of situations. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I also looked through to find places where I could teach via guided induction, which is not on your handout, but I want to tell you about it. So Russian has cases. The ending changes based on what part of speech that the word is fulfilling at that moment. So that's something that you can demonstrate via guided induction instead of just saying, when it's a direct object, it ends in oo. Ta-da, now you know, right? Another one is the book. And I'm pretty sure this textbook invented these, the 5, 7, and 8-letter spelling rules, which is just after these 5 letters, you don't write unstressed O. After these 7 letters, you don't write this letter, you write this one. So those are nonsense, right? There's a better way to demonstrate to students that these spelling rules exist, and guided induction could be a great way to do it. There are 2 prepositions in Russian that mean in, and they are used with different words, and there is a pattern, so doing that. In the first semester content of my textbook, they learn 3 different words for study, and it's study in an institution, studying a subject, and like going to the library to study, like doing studying. So that's something that instead of me just saying what I just said to you, I could do with guided induction, and then 2 different words for also. They mean different things. So I just looked at my list of topics that I want to cover in first semester, and I found these. So it's there. There's room for guided induction as well. So finding room for IC, first I looked at my goals and my learning outcomes from a previous syllabus and my current course, and I found all of those things related to interactional competence that I mentioned. And then I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to include this, how do I assess it? And this is something that we've been working on in the center for a long time now, especially a lot of the people who you've already heard from. So here's what I decided. You notice I didn't include interactional competence as a separate bullet point. Some people do, some people don't. But I decided to work it in to my existing grade scheme. And so under there, you'll see quizzes and exams. Notice I didn't bold very much. That's very similar to what I would have been doing anyway. Unit exams, oral exams, and I think the biggest change in oral exams is that I stopped pretending they're anything but a role play and an interview, right? It says a role play and an interview with your instructor, because that's what they are. It's not natural occurring conversation. It is what it is, so I'm going to call it what it is. And then quizzes, I decided to include the possibility of language analysis on the quizzes, so that's listed. But what I did change is the speaking and writing project, because everybody has one, right? They do a presentation at the end of the semester, they write a little essay, whatever. Mine will be having conversations outside of class like we've been talking about, one with a Russian student at another university over Skype, one with a tutor, both are video recorded, and then they have to correspond with that same student at the other university over email, like a pen pal. So that's how I decided to work it in as a project. Instead of a project that's not interactional, this is. So that's where I included it. So I did this by looking at my outcomes, which are openings and closings, and addressing misunderstandings and conversation. Those are the two I decided to focus on purpose with the lesson plans we've been talking about. So I'll have the lesson plans with the data, and I know I have data on openings and closings in Russian, which is another thing. I could do invitations and compliments if I find data by then, right? I might not. And it's going to be a varied assessment. They're going to be opening and closing conversations a lot. And so I'll be able to look at it in different ways. I'll target it for grading only at certain times, but it'll be present so I can give feedback on it at many different occasions. They'll have practice with not just me, but somebody who's a peer, and also someone who's a tutor, so it's like in between me and the peer, I guess. And then self-reflection, which I think is really important for, as we've seen, where they reflect on what they're able to do. So instead of just having one assessment that's focused on it, you look at it in a lot of different ways, I think is helpful. So given what I've shown you as my example, talk to your neighbors about what can you do with IC in your course? Do you see room for it? How could you assess it? And instead of changing your entire course, which might not be possible for everyone, if you have requirements that are imposed upon you especially, what can you do? Can you fit it in? Is there room for it?
I think we don't have to find room. I think what you're pointing out is that we're already doing it, it's just the approach. So the way I used to teach hello and goodbye was not an interactional competence approach, right? So I'm already doing it, I just have to approach it in an IC way.
We're talking about the fact that they're having a very hard time seeing how this would fit in a program like the one they have.
We address it, but we don't have time to assess.
I think there are different ways to approach this, and then we can keep talking about it. And this is something Mariam mentioned yesterday, which was if you do create a global assessment tool, it has to be flexible because everything you're looking for in interaction won't occur every time. Like there might not be a need for repair, and then what do? Oh no, repair didn't happen because they didn't need it. So instead, I think what you can do is you can do the more global flexible assessment as a rubric on things. But another thing you can do is if you're already doing role plays, I don't see any reason why you couldn't add to your rubric a section on whatever you're targeting. So I'm targeting openings and closings in the fall. That's only 2 things. I'm not adding to every topic I'm doing because I don't necessarily have the data, but I can give them feedback on what they did in the role play as part of this goal. I can focus on it in conversation when I talk to them, and also providing opportunities for a variety of types of conversation will make it easier to assess this because then you'll have more to look at with your students. So having them talk to more people than just each other and you is often just all you need in order to figure out how to assess this. But adding it to what you're already doing, even if it's just one line, did they ask for clarification when they didn't understand? That's already something new, maybe not new, maybe you're already doing it, that can help you start to move in this direction that doesn't require you to change everything you're doing. And sometimes you can't change everything you're doing. Sometimes you're not allowed to, and sometimes that's just, you can't maybe convince your department that you should be allowed to, things like that. So
I'm thinking that in a certain way, I'm sure you do assess your students' language skills, right? You do have certain exams that you're doing, even if they are not oral exams, even if they're only written exams, correct?
and I know some people here are adding language analysis questions to the written exam, just like one question, right?
So it may really be just a little section of that exam, either if it's really just, you're really restricted by your written exam, it could be a little section going there. You don't have to change everything and start all over again because then that's very scary. It's just like adding a little element and maybe removing something that's more traditional and maybe it's not that useful at the end.
And for your oral exam, if you just change a little bit your rubric, you don't have to change the exam itself, you can change the rubric.
So, for example, I incorporated a comedy show about marriage meeting and the arrangement or whatever. And then that would take me, for example, 2 classes, like 50 minutes times 2. And what I get from there is just the comprehension of students, and they would understand the culture, and they would laugh, whatever. When I have to come to make them produce, I will have to make role play that will depend on only 10% of the vocab they've seen, because they cannot do everything, even though they are intermediate students.
Very simple questions, there could be some multiple choices just added there. And then also taking into consideration that they need some time for that info to sink in. I mean, it's just not something that we can teach and right away make it. So there are certain things that take a little bit more exposure in order to be learned, especially when it comes to culture differences, especially when coming to a different culture completely. So it might just need more little exposure to it gradually, and then maybe at an exam it can be some multiple choices. It could be something much easier to assess them.
This is something, if you look on our website at the workshop by Torsten Hoot, who was here in December, he suggested at very beginning levels when they don't have the linguistic resources necessary, if you want them to reflect on cultural practices, just to have them answer questions in English. And it's not a big deal, you can put it on the test, talk about X cultural thing, what do you know about it, what have you learned about it in class, and that way you're making sure they're getting the content you want them to get out of it, and you're not worrying about, oh, they don't know how to say it. So
when we started with working with interactional competence, this was not in our exams either, because we were not confident enough of how to test this into the exam. Now we have specific ways of testing this in the exams, but if you add just homework to your syllabus, in which the students have to work on a specific project, in which they have to do some research at home, or they recover some of the information that they had in the classroom, or you design an exercise to test them on what they learned in the classroom, that's already assessing them. So when we think about assessment, many times we think only about the exam. The exam is just one way of assessing the students. We have many other instruments that we can use to assess them.
Kevin gave a presentation at the symposium we had in the spring where he did three conversations throughout the semester, one at the beginning, one in the middle, one at the end. He had 2 targeted IC lesson plans last spring. And then the reflections of the students at the end, I think, were extremely important because they said, I have never thought about my own language in this way before.
The reflections. The students in a lot of our second semester portions did their reflections at the beginning, right after their first interaction, and they did another reflection in the middle of the semester, and they did one final reflection at the end. And those things we used them to sort of see their progress, but through their own perspective.
And as I'm sure Mariam and Olade would tell you, because they've been working on this, creating an assessment that just works for IC is very difficult.
It took us, I think, we're at version maybe 16 or 18, and I still
So it's not necessarily something, it's maybe easier to think about these other things, self-assessment, self-checklists, not necessarily assigning a grade to it all by itself. I didn't give it a line in my syllabus all by itself. It's incorporated into other things.
that they do speak in class, they do speak with you. I think I'm thinking that there is probably a difference between, yes, they do all speak among each other and with you, but it's different than becoming aware of how do we all start a conversation or end a conversation, ask for something in Spanish versus in English, because they may transfer to everything from English to Spanish and think it would work. And if they are not made aware of it, it's true that they're going to be talking among each other, but to what extent can they really pay attention to those things? Even if you can just do one thing during, throughout your program, or focus on 2 things, that would be also awesome. Again, think very, very small, but just it would be just a very small addition to what you're doing.
I think that I'm just remembering the first time that I was going to try to incorporate this, the first time I had data that I needed to look at, and it was overwhelming because in my mind I thought if I have a 5-minute conversation or if I have a sitcom, I have to use the entire thing. And 5 minutes of conversation transcribed is pages.
Yeah.
A 10-minute sitcom or 15-minute sitcom is a lot of time and stuff. So the first thing I learned right away when I started doing IC and working with authentic data, I do not, and I should not use the entire whatever piece that I have, that I should really, as you were saying, focus. And if it's a sitcom that's 20 minutes long, I need to make my choice. Right, and say, within this sitcom, what is my target, what is my goal, we're gonna look at this, instead of trying to give them an entire experience.
I hope this was helpful, thinking about it from the other end instead of the front.